Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. As my listeners know, we talk to a range of people involved in the education space. Tonight, talking specifically about coaching and about how we should be coaching not just our teachers, but our school leaders to ensure that the instruction that we're providing our students is quality instruction. What coaching cycles in particular can and should look like. So what are those moves that those of us who do coach in the space, coach teachers, what are those moves in terms of how we support those teachers? I'm really excited to be joined by Gene Tavernetti. He is co-founder and owner of TESS Consultants out in Fresno, California, and the author of Maximizing the Impact of Coaching Cycles. So Gene, thank you for joining us today.
I am really excited about being here. Anytime I can talk about instructional coaching with another coach, I'm excited.
Gene, before we even get into that, before we get into what coaching should be versus what it often is, could you tell us a little bit more about how your journey to becoming a coach and coach of coaches came to be? What led you in this direction in your career?
Sure. I was a teacher, coach, counselor, administrator for a number of years and decided to work for a consulting firm that specialized in explicit instruction. What we did is that we trained teachers in explicit instruction and the follow-up support. I had been a football coach, and coaching, working one-on-one was something that I enjoyed. I enjoyed working with adults and helping them get better because I knew if they got better, the students would be doing better. They would be learning more, and learned a lot in the past 20 years.
So what were some of those things that you learned, Gene, in terms of, for example, how is coaching individual teachers similar or different to coaching, say, on the football field?
When we're coaching adults, what was happening in the beginning, when I was working for this other group, they had a model where they would do what might be called lesson studies now. The way that process worked is that they would say, okay, a third grade team, you're going to design a lesson, and then Gene will meet with you. And when he gets there, we'll pull straws and decide who's going to teach that lesson. However many members were on that team, one teacher wrote that lesson. That just didn't work. When we went off on our own, we had two caveats for districts that hired us or schools that hired us. Number one was that the administrator would be involved in every part of the process. They would be present in every part of the process. And then the other thing was that every teacher would be coached. And the first time would be individually. Guess what? Some teachers didn't want to have to meet with the coach. And there were times when we spent a half hour just listening to why they didn't want to be coached and why they didn't need to be coached and how awful when they had this done to them before, and it was done to them, why they didn't want to do it. We realized that we had to be more structured. And so what we developed, which is what we call learning cycles, which again, coaching cycles rather, is another one of those words that means different things to different people. Some talk about coaching cycles being weeks long. We talk about a coaching cycle lasting 2 days. And so what we do in our coaching cycles is the first day we meet and we talk about a lesson that's going to be taught the next day. not a week from later, but the next day. And we collaboratively plan. And I tell the teachers, this is your lesson. I don't want it to be my lesson. The next day, they teach the lesson, we observe it. And I say whoever was involved in the planning process, it's going to be an administrator and or a coach. These days, many times it's their instructional coach. We observe the lesson, and the next day we meet and we talk about it. In 2 days, we do that cycle.
I love the immediacy of it because, to your point, something that is 5 weeks away, yeah, I could do it, or yeah, I'll get to it. But the immediacy of what a teacher needs now and how that teacher is bringing that into their classroom now, those are teachable moments that are quite impactful. I like how you look at coaching cycles as planning the lesson, delivering the lesson, and then feedback, and doing that all in tight agreement with one another, I guess is the way
Yes.
I'd like to say that. Something before that I'd like to get back to a little bit. And you were saying that it's important to do this work with administrators in sync with you. Could you describe why we want our administrators to be in sync with our consultants and being fully vested in that process? Because I could tell you, Gene, I've worked in schools as a consultant myself, where sometimes the administrators have been a partner with me, and sometimes they've been a little bit more removed. Rather than me tell you what I think and why I think administrators should obviously be involved, could you tell our listeners a little bit why you think the administrator really needs to be a full partner when they hire an outside consultant?
Let's start with training. Even if there's an agreement that we're brought in to do training, there may be disagreements about how we propose teachers do things versus how it's been done in the past. If there's not an administrator there, it's very easy for a teacher to raise their hand and say, you know what, that's all very good, but you know what they told us to do? When that comes up and the administrator's there, we'll just say, could you address that? And I'll give you an example. One time we were talking about learning objectives. I like to keep things fairly simple. I say, you need a very simple learning objective. And they say, but that's not how we do it here. And this just happened to be a district that was under sanctions. I turned to the assistant sup for instruction and I said, could you clarify? In this district, the superintendent had attended every training. The superintendent said, we're going to meet at lunch and talk about it. And we met at lunch, talked about it. I told them argued for why I thought was reasonable, but I don't care what you want to do about learning objectives. That's the least of my worries. We came out and they told the teachers, they settled the issue right then. They know everything I'm saying. There's not going to be many misinterpretation, and so they're there. They know what's going on. And every teacher knows the principal and this outside person are in sync. When we are in doing the coaching cycles and we're doing the lesson planning, I will tell the teacher, this is a parallel training. Not that this is radically different from what you've been doing, but it's a little bit different. You're being trained at the same time your principal's being trained. And so there's going to be the same message all the time. And there'll be times during the lesson that I will excuse myself from the teacher and I'll turn to the principal. I said, let me clarify that of how this looks maybe in kindergarten or whatever, so that the teacher knows that it's a parallel training going on. So that's critical. Plan the lesson together. We observe the lesson together. And before we talk to the teacher, we're going to collaborate and identify, what did you see? Let's talk about what you saw, because they haven't been looking for those things that they brought us in to talk about. And then with the brief, I can't tell you the number of principals and vice principals and coaches who said, wow, I just didn't know how to say that. I didn't know now I know what to tell a teacher. I know how to tell a teacher. So it's a dual training. Everybody's on the same page and we're moving along together.
I do very similar practices. I might engage with principals, those folks that have co-observed with me, in a debrief process where we each put our own initial thoughts on, say, chart paper in terms of specific things we were going to look for. Let's say we were going to look at formative assessment and student voice. We'd have one poster for student voice, one poster for formative assessment, a glow column, and an opportunity column, where everyone has a different color post-it. And then they put on the board where they think the glows and the opportunities were. And then if others come around and see the same thing, they could put a check mark on that with their color marker, or maybe they have their own color post-it. And then we align the post-its to see where there's commonalities, right? So you could do it one of two ways.
Right.
Either the post-its or each person has a different color marker and then they just put a check if they agree with what somebody else said. I've done it both ways. And to your point, where you were saying how administrators will say, wow, I didn't know how to really to say that before. I didn't realize the common trends that multiple people were seeing. It is a good way to get a common understanding or a grounding or where the needs could be, so coaching could focus on those areas. Could you think, Gene, of other reasons why having outside coaches might be a good thing? I'm not saying anything against having inside instructional coaches. What are the benefits to having an outside coach?
Outside coaches, because of their experience in various systems, know that more is possible most times than we're asking teachers to do. I'll give you an example. It's an initial visit with a principal. I always want to know, what have you been doing? What are you doing? I want to be sure that my message matches what you're doing exactly. I want it to complement. I don't want to come in and say you guys are not doing anything right, because that's not true. Everybody's working hard. But more than once, I'll have a principal say, well, this year, our teachers have agreed that they're going to have a learning objective. And I stutter, just like I did. I want to clarify, for the entire year, you want that? Yes, for the entire year. And at that point, I'm just getting to know them. I don't tell them that that's not enough. But I'll give you another example of lowered expectations. Working in a district, and the principal is involved with the lesson planning during the coaching cycle. And this teacher, she wasn't comfortable about some of the things she was doing. And she had been through a training, which we always want teachers to go through a training first. Not want to, they do go through a training first before we work with them. And she's in there with the principal, and we go through the process that lead the teachers through a planning process. And at the end of the process, right before we're about to say goodbye, the principal says, now, you know what, Miss Jones, this is a lot. Do you want to just focus on a couple things? And this is where I've changed over the years. And I told the principal, no, she could do it, because it's a coherent plan. It makes sense. Does it make sense to you, Miss Jones? Yes. And she came in the next day and nailed it. The point is, if there hadn't been competent work before, then they literally don't know what the teacher can do. That's an important reason for an outside consultant.
If I'm hearing you correctly, it's really about holding building administration accountable and ensuring that administration is asking the most of its people, but in a way that is sustainable and doable. Not to downplay the coaching, but really to push each school to push the teachers to do what they are capable of doing, in other words.
We hear a lot, there's a lot in the coaching literature about respect. It's not respectful to have lower expectation of kids. It's not respectful. If you're telling me your teacher's a professional and now you don't have high expectations for that teacher, that's disrespectful. The other thing that I'm going to respect is I'm going to respect your time. I am not going to waste your time. Everything that I do in a coaching cycle is timed. When you come in to plan a lesson, if you're a secondary teacher, you're coming in for a period. The bell rings, you're out of here. On the other hand, if we're done early, I'm not going to keep you. We're done. when we go watch the lesson, if you're in a first grade class and you're teaching a lesson, if that lesson goes more than 25 minutes, that's too long. You should be done by then. I have other things scheduled and I'm leaving. No disrespect, but I'm leaving because I know you'll finish the lesson. And when we do the debrief, most teachers are so anxious and nervous. They're not going to remember what you said. This is no time to help them get better. This is to help them understand, I saw what you did. Let's talk about some of the things that you want to talk about during this debrief. But I make a big deal. I pull my phone out right away. I said, you know what? I know you and we could talk forever. So I'm setting my alarm for 12 minutes. And when it goes off, that's going to give us a couple minutes. And in 15 minutes, you're out of here. And then you know what? Like when you had your checklist of all those things, same thing. We're not going to talk about everything that could have happened, but guess what? We're going to have a list of unsaid things that's going to be in common with a lot of other teachers. And we're going to do a PD or we're going to meet at another time to do the remediation, but not right then. All they want to do, most teachers, all they want to do is get it over with. They wipe their brow and say, wow, is that it? That's it. Why? What else do you want to talk about? That's respect. And I think another way of demonstrating respect, I do not go into classrooms and do demonstration lessons. I may do something for a couple minutes that's new to them, but they're professionals. Even if they're new, and I'm going to go tell a veteran, watch me do this lesson. No, I'm not. That to me, disrespectful. There are ways to show respect, true respect.
And the other way I believe you're showing respect in what you're saying, Gene, is when they come to you and you're saying, well, what do you want to talk about? Where is your need? How can I help you sort out what you want to sort out? Rather than necessarily saying, oh, you must work on this or you have to do this. Again, that's showing respect for their professionalism and where they want to grow. It really does need to be this partnership. Just like we talk about student agency and learning, where's the agency for the teacher?
Let me tell you how I get there. One of the things, I don't know if I said this yet, but I think I did, that there has to be some agreement about what's happening during instruction. Some general things that are we want kids to talk to each other. We want teachers to be doing continuous formative assessment. There are all sorts of these things that we agree about. So when we're meeting to plan the lesson, we'll list those things on the board and say, where is this happening? How are you going to do it here? Blah, blah, blah. We're taking what the organizational needs, and then we're asking the teacher, how are you going to do it? There's their agency. Now, when we get to the debrief, I ask 3 questions. Number 1, how do you think the lesson went? What did you do differently today than how we planned it the day before? And then the third thing, what would you do differently? What happens is then they will start talking about something that they could do better, something why they changed something. Just like when you walk out of that observation with somebody, you might have 12 things to talk about. But when they say, oh, when I did this, like, you know what, Miss Jones, that's exactly what I wanted to talk about. And then we could talk about it. And now we're doing what you said, but we're still focused. They have some agency, but we're still focused on things that are going to help them get better and things that are still going to be in our list to talk about with all teachers in a subsequent PD or something.
For those administrators in schools that don't say hire an outside consultant such as yourself or myself, I heard some really good basic practices that they can engage in if they're the ones that are going to be coaching their teachers. So I've heard you mention a quick cycle, planning, observation, debrief. I heard you mention 3 key questions in the debrief where you focus on what the teacher feels and what the teacher wants. Also, you talked about respecting the teacher. Are there any other quick tips that you would give for administrators who are also acting as coaches if they don't hire outside consultants?
Okay.
What should they be doing?
Part of it is what they should not be doing. One of the things I talk about in my book about observations, do not bring a device with you because many principals will come in and say, oh, this is great. I could take notes here and this will be their evaluation. No, this is not about that. This teacher is anxious. This teacher is nervous. So I tell them bring no devices because every time you're on that device typing, the teacher's wondering what's going on. What did I do? And as when they're not thinking about what's going on, you're detracting from their performance. You're not getting an authentic look at what the teacher can do. Don't bring a device. It's not about you. Take notes. I tell the teachers what kind of notes I'm going to take. I show them and during the planning cycle. So number one, don't bring a device. Number two, smile. I use that old Star Trek, the prime directive, where you don't interfere with the culture of an alien planet. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but when you're in there, the principal say, oh, I have a chance to interact with kids. No, that's not your job there. You're there to smile and see, does the teacher see all the things that's going on? Is the teacher going to correct that behavior? Is the teacher see that kids are struggling? So once you get into that space, you've destroyed your observation about what can this teacher really do. And what we really want to do when we're observing teacher is how do they think about what's going on? And based on their observation and their analysis of the situation, how do they respond?
So now I actually have a follow-up. As a coach, sometimes, and I'm putting myself out there, I will, and I mean, not to get into a disagreement with you, I will go over to a
I love
student.
disagreements. Let's go.
I will go up to a student and say, well, what are you working on? What are you doing? Right? Just to get a sense if they understand. But I do understand your point about perhaps not interfering with the culture. What would you recommend to a coach like me who does still want to see what the students are getting out of the lesson, but in a way that does preserve the culture that, say, someone like me or an administrator could still figure out what the student's getting out of a lesson without interacting with the students?
One of the things that I think is important is where the actual physical location of where you are during the lesson. If I'm in a back row and my preference is a student desk in the back row, and if I don't have a student desk, I'll take a seat in the back, a chair in the back row. So what does that mean? I can observe half a dozen kids. I'm not looking over their shoulder and seeing exactly what their work is, but I can see their level of participation. And the other thing that I can see is if we have done a good job during the lesson planning part, learning the lesson design, is we will have talked about how are you going to check for understanding with these kids? How do you know how they're doing? So I should be able to see the teacher's face, respond to if those kids are actually doing what they're doing. The other place that I will sit is on the side. Here's what I want to know after the lesson, and it's going to be one of the questions that I ask the teacher: who struggled? Who struggled? When did they struggle? What I really want to know is, does the teacher know? I think as a skilled observer, we can figure it out. We can figure it out between the sample size of what we can see and the reaction of the teacher.
Think of, say, 2 or 3 clients you worked with that really, hit it out of the park, making their school instructional culture from point A to point B.
Here's what I could tell you. The reality is that there is no school that does everything uniformly. What I tell people who say, can we go see what you do? I said, I can point you to some teachers, but I can't point you to an entire school. If I did that, even if they were doing it, they were already doing it. It wasn't because of me.
How does coaching coaches differ from coaching teachers?
Number one, we are always focused on instruction. This is why I wrote my book. Building relationships and trust and all that's fine, but this is about instruction. And that's why when I'm training coaches, you know what we talk about? Instruction. We talk about planning lessons. When the teacher's gone, we debrief about what did you learn about this session. And then when we observe lessons, we do what you talked about after you debrief together. What did you see? How did you see it? What do you think is the most important thing that we want to share with this teacher? Because we're not going to share six, because we can't tell them you did a good job and then tell them, oh, and here are the dozen things that you can work on. We talk about that, and we talk about entering conversations. So when I work with coaches, we're working on instruction, we're working on coaching cycles, because we during those coaching cycles we get to find out what teachers are saying. Sometimes you get to work with tough teachers. When I say tough teachers, initially, again, those teachers that like, why am I here? And a coach gets to see, how do I handle that? How do we get someplace else? So, and then just like in working with anybody in teaching, we're going to do a gradual release of responsibility. I'm going to start asking the coach more, bringing the coach in more. Because the first time when I'm working with the coach, I'm telling me, your job is, in my nicest teacher voice, sit down, shut up, and watch.
Yeah.
Because you'll get to see. One of the things I tell them is, it's not about you. You need to be quiet and see how smart they are, and then participate. And then they'll do the debrief.
And then again, that builds the capacity internally, so they don't necessarily need a coach. I mean, Gene, I had the conversation with schools where I said, yeah, my job is to actually, in some ways, work myself out of a job.
Yeah.
And somebody told me, well, then how do you earn a living? I said, well, hopefully you'll recommend me to new schools.
If a consultant is someplace for more than 2 years, 2 years is the tops. My job is to prepare your teachers for me not to be there.
When it comes to working with quote unquote difficult teachers, A, how do you define that? Do you define that way? And what are some ways to help people who are resistant to coaching be more accepting of it?
I accept the fact that they may have had a bad experience at coach. What I tell the principal, I say before we start, you say that everybody's going to meet with the coach. Everybody. But that doesn't mean they're first. So we are going to strategically, like when I do coaching cycles, we're there for 2 or 3 days, 2 days if it's elementary, 3 days if it's secondary, just because of the scheduling that needs to take place. If there's a staff of 30, they may be in the fifth group. One of the things I say in the book is that after I work with a teacher and they say, wow, that's it. This is actually pretty good. Say, you know what? Tell your friends, because I can't convince them. The coach can't convince them, because otherwise you're just a salesman. But if a colleague tells them, then they're going to at least be open. Are they still going to come in and we're going to have to air grievances? Yeah. I tell my coaches, adhere to something called second spouse theory. You don't have to be perfect. You only have to be better than the last one. And so as long as that coaching experience is better, then you're golden. That doesn't mean it's easy. And it's taken me a long time to get there.
Gene, is there anything that we haven't mentioned about coaching teachers or coaching coaches that you want our listeners to know?
You are instructional coaches. You need to be experts in instruction. You don't need to be expert in all content, but you need to be expert in instruction, because when a teacher asks a question, they want an answer. I will tell them, sometimes the answer is, this isn't magic. I mean, it's only going to be better. It's not magic. But you're respecting the teacher. You're respecting, yeah, that's tough. This is not an easy job. This is one of the toughest jobs there is. But I respect that, and I'm going to be honest with you, and we'll work through it together. And I love working with those teachers that initially are a little bit more difficult, because they're the ones that will go out and really spread the word.
Gene, where can people find out more about you and the work that you do?
I'm on, as they say, on the socials, actually just Twitter. I refuse to say that other. Twitter at G Tavernetti. And my website is tesscg.com, like TESS Consulting Group.com. And I have a Facebook page as well, TESS Consulting.
Gene, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks, John.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.